Hi, welcome. My topic today is how the city as a technology mediates to wilderness. And I will also discuss how this self-demarcation from the wild stands in tension with the city's inevitable participation in nature and natural systems. I will start with Aristotle's Politics, where he famously stated that it is in the polis that human nature is perfected to a state of autonomy as opposed to mere survival. It is in human nature to be a political animal, to live together, to use language in order to express what is just. And it is the polis that enables this perfected state of humanity. And Aristotle considers people outside the polis, such as nomads, as people without virtue and who are, quote, the worst and the wildest life forms. Here I will make a huge leap to Thomas Hobbes in early modern philosophy. And Thomas Hobbes was actually also an Aristotle scholar, so a lot of the ideas are quite similar, though with some differences. He too considers that outside the civitas, the city, in the sense of its social relations, man is a wolf to man. However, by contrast to Aristotle, he doesn't think that the city is a combination of human nature. Rather, he considers it as distinctly artificial. It is a political space that is constructed by human agency and in some sense discontinuous from nature, even though it is not unnatural completely. And as the historian Annabel Bratt has argued, even though at this time territorial states gain precedence over cities as a form of life, the idea of civilized life is still very much parasitic on the city, on the life within city walls. So it is people who dwell in cities that are considered civilized and polite. And polite also comes from, etymologically, from the word for city, polis. This is an illustration of Thomas Hobbes' book, De Tiden, from 1642. And on the left, we have a figure standing for imperium, for this territorial state that's rising to power at this time. And this figure is clad in luscious clothes. There's a crown, a sword, and a scale signifying justice. And in the background, we see farmers working orderly and peacefully. And on the vista in the mountainside behind, there's a city. So it's kind of a celebration of this feudal idea where we have fortified settlements and feudal lords living in the castles and having their dominion over the lands around, and making sure that justice is being served and that work is being conducted properly. On the opposite side, we have a figure representing libertas, freedom. And it's a drawing of one of the indigenous tribesmen from Americas. And this is also a time of exploration. So kind of this coming into contact with these other peoples and other ways of life was a great challenge for European philosophy at the time. And this figure represents libertas, freedom, because they are not under the rule of any sovereign. So they're free, but Hobbes understands this freedom in very negative terms. As you see in the background, these figures are hunting each other with bows and arrows. So this is Hobbes' idea of the state of nature, where there's a war with everyone against everyone, and is only under the rule of a sovereign that kind of law and justice is achieved. And to take another huge leap, we're coming to modernist architecture in the beginning of the 20th century, where many of these ideas are very much alive. So for instance, Le Corbusier's narrative, kind of a genealogical narrative of a founding myth of architecture, is as follows. Primitive man has halted his chariot. He has decided that here shall be his home ground. He chooses a clearing and cuts down the trees that crowd it in. The pegs of his tent describe a square, hexagon, or octagon. The palisade of the settlement forms a rectangle whose four sides are equal. So the idea is that man makes his home in the world by delimiting his space from the rest of nature, from the wild, using these very clear-cut geometrical forms. And it's since the time of Plato and Vitruvius that geometry stands for the realm of ideas, unchanging rational relationships that are thought of in opposition to the unpredictable wild. And this is very much alive in Le Corbusier's work as well, this idea, the celebration of geometry. For instance, we see here his La Vie Radieuse from 1930, an unrealized utopian project. And you see these very strict geometrical forms and buildings at right angles to each other, and trees that are there but are in very specific locations, very arranged and curated. And there is this idea that that Le Corbusier had, which is that in building this way, sunshine is distributed equally. And back in those days, they thought that sunshine kills microbes. So the idea of healthy cities is the idea of kind of these perfectly geometrical cities where everyone had equal access to sunshine and were enabled to live a healthy life. And as you may know, modernist architecture has come under severe criticism, even back then in Le Corbusier's time. And it was criticized for its sterility, which was actually wanted because of this idea of sunlight killing microbes. They wanted to create a kind of sterile aesthetic of a hospital in a way, but also the anonymity and kind of lifelessness of it all. So to come to the 21st century, a movement called HyperNatural Architecture arose in a strict opposition to modernist architecture. And Brownell and Swackhammer describe it as follows. More advanced human creations, such as a city, tend to resemble the inherent complexities and behaviors of natural systems and must adhere to natural principles in order to endure. It is also attributable to an emerging outlook that positions humanity as part of the natural world rather than separate from it. So what they call hypernatural architecture is this idea that architecture isn't there in opposition to nature, but it is a part of it, and it kind of elevates nature to a new level. Some examples are Silk Pavilion by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. What they did here is they created a scaffolding for a building, and then they allowed the silkworms to finish it, so to build their silk around it. So they allowed nature to, in its own chaotic and unpredictable ways, to finish the structure and create these beautiful natural patterns. Another example are the living bridges in the state of Meghalaya in India, where local people create a scaffolding across the river, and then they allow rubber fig tree roots to grow across it over 15 years and to take root on the other side of the river, creating this natural bridge structure, which can last for hundreds of years, actually. And a final example is biological concrete in Catalonia. And here, microalgae are used on the facade of a building to cool the building down and to absorb CO2. And of course, there's some ethical considerations about the use of these organisms kind of as means in architecture, but we cannot focus on these right now, since I'm discussing the question between the relation of the city as a human political sphere in opposition to nature or in participation to nature. In Michael Hampus' recent book on the wild, he argues that the city mediates and buffers to the wild because both are both the city and the wild are co-defined historically. So the wild is all that the city, where the people are not, and the city is the system of complex social relationships that only works kind of in a very controlled and disciplined environment. From the perspective of philosophy of technology, we could say that the city, like any other technology, mediates power and political interactions. So the way the city as a physical structure, as urbs, is built has an effect on the way the city works as civitas, as kind of this complex of social relationships and political relationships. And like other technologies, the city can be said to mediate in which ways people can be plural, to quote Verbeek's latest paper. From the perspective of philosophy of architecture, I can say that architecture articulates relations of belonging and exclusion, not only amongst humans, but also to the natural world. So most bluntly, with the use of walls to create separations. To conclude, I do think that cities can be regarded as technologies for producing kind of a human political sphere in demarcation from the wild. But this demarcation needs to be regarded as constructed, as historically shifting, and always in need of critical reflection. And I do think that the HyperNatural Architecture takes an important step in pointing out and making visible that this demarcation is not absolute, that there's kind of this dynamic interactions between different natural ecological systems, even within the city. However, I would also point out that even in architecture, in HyperNatural Architecture, even while the city is regarded as part of nature, this wilderness is carefully curated. So as you may notice, it is only very harmless organisms that are implemented in architecture, such as silkworms and microalgae. So it is not so much the case that the city is made more wild. It can be argued that it's more so that the wilderness is instrumentalized and implemented into this kind of control system that is the city. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion.